Miguel, it's my great delight to pass things to you. Welcome to the Balsillie School, and the floor is yours.
I will focus on making a summary. I don't know the backgrounds of people regarding Venezuela, so I will assume you guys are up to date up until January the 3rd, and I'll start there. But I will take 20 minutes to share with you the way I see what it's going on, what are the potential outcomes, what are the opportunities and the risks. And if you want to make a question that brings me back to background on Venezuela and basic things that happened before you might not be acquainted with, I will be very happy to do that. So first thing I want to say is what happened on January the 3rd caught everybody by surprise. Everybody in Venezuela, in government, and also everybody in the opposition. What has occurred so far, it's the removal of Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, who are now in a federal jail in Brooklyn and were brought into U.S. justice for the number of charges that have been made to them related to essentially drug trafficking, but also the sellings of Venezuelan passports to members of Hezbollah and other Middle East agents they used to work with. Those are, I believe, the principal charges. What happened after that happened in the hours of the morning of January the 3rd. A few hours later, President Trump held a press conference where he announced that he would be working with a group in Venezuela and that the group has willingness to obey his orders and commands. And if they didn't, he would be willing to implement what he called a second wave of attacks. And it turns out the group the President Trump is working with is Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who has been sworn in as president. Her brother, Jorge Rodriguez, is the president of the National Assembly. These are two figures that have been present in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez from 98, from the very outset, to 2013 when Chavez passed away, and remain relevant as before when Nicolás Maduro came up in 2013. So essentially what has occurred is not regime change. What has occurred so far is 12 days since the removal of Maduro. What has occurred is dictatorship or dictator change. The rest of the apparatus so far remains the same. When I say the rest remains the same, is that the country has a number that has been estimated by NGOs of political prisoners amounting 820. Up to yesterday, a little less than 80 had been released. So essentially 90% of political prisoners remain in jail. The government, the sworn-in government, interim government, has released a list of 400 political prisoners. They say they have released, but many of them are not political prisoners. Many of them are just regular people that were in prison for misdemeanors of other type, other than having your own opinion on Venezuelan affairs. The opposition in exile, and I'll talk briefly now about Maria Corina Machado, as we speak, cannot return to the country. All the opposition that was chastened out of the country remains in exile and cannot take a flight and return to the country tomorrow. The repression apparatus is pretty much in place. The only factor holding on together the Maduro regime and now the Delcy Rodriguez regime was a significant apparatus of repression that has carried tortures that have been well documented by Human Rights Watch and other international organizations. The apparatus remains in place. And interestingly enough, the people that have been released, the political prisoners that have been released, have not been given freedom after being released. They have not had their rights restored in terms of they have been released under very specific set of restrictions, meaning they cannot talk in media, they cannot use social media to voice their opinions. They clearly cannot participate politically, so they sort of have a country for jail so far. And that is the situation on the ground. Actually, a lot very little has changed. A lot of what was there before Maduro remains in place exactly as it used to be. I have relatives living in Venezuela, and their lives have changed very little. So there was a removal, I would say, a surgical removal of a dictator that was then substituted by another. In that press conference, President Donald Trump said a number of conditions have been put forward to Delcy Rodriguez that she is very happy to comply with. Those conditions have not been released. The word elections was not mentioned. Democracy wasn't part of the press conference. What was said later by Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor, was that they perceived the order of things in Venezuela should be stabilization, should be recovery, and then political transition. So that's the order they are thinking. So these are the facts. I probably spent 10 minutes to explain what I think are the facts. And what follows is my interpretation of the facts is that I think the way and the order the US has perceived things to follow maybe is not the right one, and it's not going to work for their interests. I'm not even talking now about the Venezuelan people. I believe that stabilization in Venezuela, what they call political stability right now and for a number of years, it's a consequence of the repression apparatus of government and of the system of putting massive numbers of political people protesting in the street or associated to political parties, lots of them with Vente, Maria Corina Machado's political party. Those people have been put in jail, and the threat of repression is what has kept the government in place. So my question is, if these coming weeks there are some public manifestations against Delcy Rodriguez or against the government, or public teachers protesting that they have a salary that goes between $1 to $4 per month, or employees protesting that hyperinflation, it's rampant right now, the country, it's back on its way to a hyperinflation, not yet there. Minimum salary is 50 cents of dollars per month. What is going to happen with those protests? Will the government use their repression apparatus as it has done in the past, with many people killed and thousands sent to jail? Will it do so under the sponsorship and tutelage of the US government? So I just don't know how's that going to happen. And regarding recovery, Venezuela has lost, as you might have read, 35% of its GDP in 12 years. The only economic collapse that goes beyond Venezuela's, it's Liberia. Over a 10-year civil war, Liberia lost 90% of its GDP. So Venezuela is, by a significant margin, the largest economic collapse in history, at least since World War II, that has not been preceded by a civil war or by a natural disaster. So the fall of 75% of GDP, it's a consequence of the destruction of the market mechanism. The government destroyed the market mechanism through a series of laws and substituted with central planning, expropriated all the industrial apparatus, which went from private actors to the government. The government eliminated the system of property rights in the process, so there are no property rights, there are no courts, there are no rule of law. So that's what destroyed the Venezuelan economy, and that destruction was not accidental, was systematically carried by a political elite whose only goal was to perpetuate themselves in power. Now, Delcy Rodriguez and the guys remaining there are an essential part of that elite that destroyed the Venezuelan economy, that caused an 8 million people outflow of migrants that had to leave the country, a quarter of the Venezuelan population. So the guys that destroyed the economy purposefully to guarantee that they stay in power are the ones still in charge. So I really doubt There might be some warranties given around certain investments in oil, and some investment made to capture low-hanging fruits, and oil output might even increase a bit. I doubt that the type of economic turnaround that Venezuela needs and Venezuelans are hoping for can be produced under a political system that is entirely illegitimate, that is a result of the government stealing the election of July 28, 2024, which the opposition won with more than 70% of the vote under very restrictive conditions. So probably the part I'm missing before I get to hear your questions is Maria Corina Machado's strategy. Maria Corina Machado is someone I know well that has been doing politics for 20 years. For the most part of those 20 years, she had between 1% and 5% in the polls. In the 2012 primary elections of the opposition, she got 6% of the vote. And she has kept her message steady and steadfast through time. And eventually her moment arrived. 2 or 3 years ago, she became the principal figure of the opposition. It's a massive leader that has the capacity to coordinate and strategize. And that's why we managed to demonstrate that the elections of 2024 were stolen by the government, because we have the exact results per each voting center, or at least more than 80% of them, that render the difference irreversible. She won the Venezuelan primary elections with 93% of the vote. She was banned by the government from running. She picked a candidate, Edmundo González Urrutia, to run instead of her. Edmundo González won those elections with 70%. So it's a massive operator, in someone with a very strong strategic skills. So she has been put up to tests by the whole situation. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which she arrived late in Oslo to pick 1 day late. She was a year and a half in hiding in Venezuela because she was prosecuted by the government after the election, and managed to escape, got the Nobel Prize. And I think she might have been also surprised by what happened on January the 3rd and what was decided on January the 3rd, which is essentially having the Trump administration working with the same guys that brought the massive economic collapse and impoverished Venezuela on purpose to perpetuate themselves in power. So now she's between a rock and a hard place, like one says in English. I think what is important now is that she demands what I believe she demanded yesterday in the White House. Venezuela can only hope and can only have a constitutional solution from now onwards. The Constitution of Venezuela has a provision for the absolute absence of the president. Assuming Nicolás Maduro is the president, he's an illegitimate president, is a result of stealing an election. But even assuming he's the president, a 30-day absence will force the government to call elections immediately. A temporary absence will give the vice president 90 days that can be extended another 90 days, after which the vice president has got 30 days to call for election. That it's a period of 7 months. And I believe that is a timeline that Maria Corina Machado should demand and has been demanding. I'm sure she made that point yesterday, as per her own statements after the meeting. She should demand immediate release of all political prisoners and the cease of the repression to all the political manifestations. And one thing she should also demand is the safe return of all the political leadership in exile to Venezuela, and stop the political prosecution. With that, I think what we need is an appointment of an electoral council that could be chosen jointly and can carry free and fair elections in 7 months. What I cannot tell you is if this request found sympathy in the government of the US, if this is something they have in mind. Apparently, they have expressed being aware of who is in charge in Venezuela, and are willing to work with them until they see what's the right moment to proceed with a political transition. But there are no guidelines, there are no deadlines, there are so far no specific points been made regarding this. And I will end up by saying what can happen. What are the scenarios of what can happen from where we are? I think one scenario, and it's certainly the scenario Delcy Rodriguez and company have in mind, is they manage to gain day after day, week after week, and eventually year after year, and they remain in power. The argument they have made and have convinced the Trump administration is that the opposition in Venezuela wouldn't be able to warranty the security of the country because they don't control the military apparatus. If you look at that argument and you don't give the opposition access to power, that is an argument you can do again in 3 months, and then again in 6 months, and then again in a year. So essentially, that's an argument that extends itself by its own definition, as long as the opposition is not given the opportunity to share power or get power again in a free and fair election. So one scenario that it's a certain concern and has a positive probability is that Delcy Rodriguez stay in power, either because, they managed to strike a deal that the government of the US considers fair for US interest. I think it's going to be hard to maintain, but it's a possibility. Or either because President Trump gets bored or gets distracted by another crisis or receives defeat in the midterms elections, or eventually is defeated in the presidential election of 2028. And if by then they are still there, they can prolong their status in power for a few more decades. So I think that's an option. Another option would be the more rosy option, if you will. It's just to having a transition of the type I have described. Preferences of Venezuelan are well established, like the opposition led by Corina Machado would be able to win an election by more than 90% of the vote. Those are the preferences. She already won an election with 70% of the vote that was carried under very restrictive conditions. Venezuelans abroad, a quarter of the population, were allowed to vote. And she didn't have any access to media, and she couldn't take on a flight to travel within Venezuela. This is a type of details people is not aware, but Maria Corina Machado won a national presidential election without being able to travel by plane through Venezuela, which is a country of 1 million square kilometers. So if you think that way, it's pretty big. A third option would be that the more radical wing of Chavismo-Madurismo gives a coup to Delcy Rodriguez, in which case you might have more violent people in power, and we'll have to check what would be the Trump reaction, the Trump government reaction to that. And the fourth scenario is that Venezuela falls into, I was about to say chaos, but I think it's further chaos. And the country gets appropriated by different armed groups that do not necessarily agree with each other, but controls different areas of the territory. I believe those four scenarios exhaustively capture what could happen. The signals I'm seeing so far are not optimistic in regard to the scenario that will be optimal for Venezuela, that have Venezuelans that have spent 3 decades in dictatorship and are not demanding real freedom.
Thank you so much, Miguel, for joining us today. And we hope you will come back, hopefully with a more positive and uplifting story to tell in the future. So on behalf of us all, thank you and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for the invite, and thanks everybody for your interest in Venezuela.